The most influential ism in the country today appears to be Hindutva. It has taken a long time for this ideology to come of age. But what happened to the other ideological movements that began in the early 20th century? The RSS will turn 100 years old next year, but so will the Communist Party of India. Ambedkarism, Marxism, liberalism, Dravidianism, feminism, Gandhiism. What role are these great big isms of the 20th century playing in the 21st century? What relevance do they have today?
I'm an atheist in the same way as I'm an a-leprechaun.
Why have there been casteism existing in the country still today?
Feminism, by definition, is the belief that men and women should have equal
So the
rights.
nature of the system is to be as mean and rotten as you can, to try to maximize profit.
I'm Sudipto Mondal, and welcome to this episode of What's Your Ism? Hello and welcome to What's Your Ism? I'm Sudipto Mondal, and before I start my show today, I want to read out a mail from one of the people who's been following the show. This is a person from Chennai. Her name is Sudiksha. I'm just going to read out her mail. She brings attention to a very important blind spot, I suppose, in this show and also for the News Minute as an outlet. She says, I love the series, which is What's Your Ism? Thank you. Have found the conversations very insightful, educational. And now the point that she's trying to make is that the isms that I feel would be great to explore would be environmentalism, wildlife conservation, and the climate emergency. There are many interconnected issues that come under these isms. They include depletion of green cover, illegal mining, forced displacement of Adivasi communities from their indigenous land, wild animal and human conflict due to destruction of animal habitats, and the terrible conditions in which Adivasi people are forced to live in. Now, the important suggestion, it would be great if we could have a few episodes on these crises. Environmental journalists and activists like Rishika Pardikar, Nilima Valangi, and conservationist Raza Kazmi are good choices for guests. Well, I couldn't get Nilima or Raza, but I do have Rishika Pardikar here today with us. Rishika, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invite, and it is so nice to hear our readers' comments.
Yeah.
And especially recognition of work as a freelancer, it doesn't come very easily. So
Mhm.
this is it's great. Yeah, thank you so
Right.
much.
No, thanks for coming on the show, and apologies once again to you and to our readers for how little we are able to do on these very important topics. I mean, we are often talking about human liberation. If you followed my show,
Yeah.
so many of these guests, they talk about Ambedkarism, Marxism, feminism. At some point, when we read stories such as yours, we wonder when our existence itself is threatened, what are these isms worth, or to that extent that when the revolution comes, there'll be nothing left to celebrate. There'll be no, when you talk about land distribution, the land will be not good enough by the time it is distributed,
Yeah.
and which is why I think environment is an important conversation. But Rishika, my first question to you is, as a journalist, as a reporter, tell me, does it frustrate you that a lot of what passes for climate, environmental journalism and writing gets pushed into the Sunday pages? It's weekend reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, firstly, I think that comes from an editorial decision also, where you think maybe people don't care about environmental issues. So a lot of newsrooms have this bias that readers don't care about environment, and that's why we don't care. That's how it's usually justified. But from the ground, or even from when I tell my stories to maybe my neighbors or my mother or someone I know personally, I know that they are interested. So when I talk to some ladies near my house about my next trip to some place, next trip to Nicobar, whatever, they're very interested in knowing, okay, who are those people, who is there. So I think this is part of a consequence of newsroom bias, that readers are not there, they are not interested, so we are not interested. There's a huge space for correction of that mindset because people are interested. This is one. The other important thing is, okay, don't disassociate environment from land rights issues. FRA taught us that lesson, right? FRA is not just about saving some forest somewhere. It can
The
also
Forest
be,
Rights Act.
yeah, Forest Rights Act. So it's not just about saving some forest somewhere, though it can be a tool for conservation also. But for some people, environment is very closely linked to their life. So if you speak to Chipko movement, and if you're talking about forests in the Himalayas, so it's a peasant movement, right? It was not it is an environmental movement, but it is also about people for whom environmental issues are so corely linked to their life.
Yeah.
Uh, whether it is for fuel wood, for them it is sustenance, right? They need fuel wood, or whether if it is some roots from medicinal roots, or if it's even a landslide. So if tomorrow an industry comes in their area and they set up and they cut down hills and they set up their industries, that will destroy their homes. So environmental issues for a lot of people who are dependent on environment as a primary source, for them it is not something removed, something out there in some forest. I think this is also something that, again, more editors and more reporters should recognize, that you can't disassociate environment from people who are primary users of nature. So yeah, I think there's a lot of scope for this, for people to understand this. And also, maybe I would want more environmental reporters to also think of it in this lens, because if you just talk about some tiger somewhere, some elephant somewhere, you are missing a whole chunk of people and a whole chunk of landscapes where these are very, very connected.
And you talked about connect, disconnect. The disconnect, I suppose, is from, in the minds of the mainland, in the minds of the people who
Yeah.
exist in cities such as the ones we live in here in
Yeah.
Bangalore or in a Delhi, or,
Mm.
the disconnect that, climate is interesting. The rest is political, in to the extent that the people who live in these vulnerable eco-sensitive zones uh, are very few in the end of the day, and their votes really don't matter. How do you think any of these questions can get politicized? People talk about how the climate emergency, which was once a conversation centered around these spaces you mentioned, forests,
Yeah.
you're talking about Chipko, you're talking about different climate movements that happened in those eco-sensitive zones. But now you have floods in cities, you have spectacular climate events.
Hmm.
Do you think that will finally, because now the disaster is outside your door, that people are taking it more seriously? There's a sense of urgency?
So definitely, if you're living in a city like Bangalore or wherever else in this country, which is a city, you will see people, even your neighborhood people, talking about flooding, how it has become common, how before rainfall did not cause this much trouble. They couldn't see their own streets flooding right before. Now even they recognize it. But I still think,
Do you see them becoming political as a result of this? Because this as an issue.
okay, no,
Um,
actually no, I don't see anyone.
say Delhi, this thing that happens every winter.
Yeah.
You think it
Uh,
has potential for people to get
so
mobilized
if you
around?
say, would they vote on an environmental issue, I
Yeah.
don't think so.
Mm.
If you mean, so there are many things that can be political, right? Even filing a petition in court is political. If you're challenging some government rule or some government inaction through a petition in a court, that is still political, and that is still citizens taking action. Or if you see someone going to the pollution control board, or if you see someone going to BBMP also here in Bangalore with some civic issue, with some so in the rain, if there's rainfall and your sewage drains are clogged, and if someone takes this issue to the BBMP or goes and talks to their representative also, that is still political. Would they vote on it? I don't know. Maybe not, because even our politicians don't talk about environmental issues. But are they getting more engaged? Yes, definitely. And outside of cities, though, like I said, environment has always been closely linked to life and livelihood. So there it has always been political. So FRA, land rights, they have always been political things. But yeah, now I think now more people will take up environment as a political issue. Yeah.
But am I wrong in this assumption that a lot of climate action, a lot of environmental activism happens more through the route of litigation, as opposed to public pressure, in terms of, like, you won't see it, people blocking Jantar Mantar. Now you do,
Yeah.
with Wangchuk on
Yeah.
this on this agitational path, but you'll rarely, if ever, see that kind of thing. But litigation is supposed to be the more preferred way, right? And NGOs.
So I think globally it has been, if you're talking about climate, then there's a lot of climate litigation globally, especially in global north countries. Climate litigation as of now has not taken off much in other countries, little bit, but not that much. But otherwise, environmental litigation has been a big part of our history also. So
Right.
environmental lawyers filing cases, whether it is on behalf of some groups, just by themselves. So litigation has been a way. Litigation has been one way to ensure local environment is clean. So when uh, if there's some fertilizer company, chemical company that is polluting the local water body, these cases have always been there. The NGT always hears cases like these. So yeah, environmental litigation has been a big way for
Hmm.
people to engage on this issue. And I think now maybe we'll see more movements like Wangchuk's also.
You think so?
I
And
I guess so. Yeah. And what I liked about the movement is they are linking it to a sixth schedule.
hmm,
So
it is
if so,
cultural rights, political rights, and
yes, So
autonomy to
actually,
decide your.
so
eh,
what even he says in interviews is, okay, I want my people to be able to control their own resources because they know best what we can do here and what we cannot do.
mhm,
So
mhm.
yeah, and that's how you connect environment to political issues.
Right. Interesting. And the reporting that you're just coming off of, which is what's happening in the Andamans in the Greater Nicobar Island.
Yeah.
Uh, Sixth schedule, special rights, forest rights. What is the legal framework that we are operating under? What kind of safeguards do you see absent or present in the case of
Mm.
the Great Nicobar Island? Before you get into that, first the primer, because like I said, the News Minute is not the best in terms of climate reporting, and therefore some amount of elementary level stuff. If you can talk about saying,
Yeah, okay.
what is this project in the Greater Nicobar Island? What have you been following? You've been following it for the last 5 years.
Yeah.
What's happening there?
Okay. So now the government has a huge mega project plan. So this is like a 72,000 crore project.
Yeah.
So they want to build a transshipment terminal, a port. So a transshipment terminal is like, uh, so big ships can't come to shore. They have to load their all their cargo into a smaller ship, and then the smaller ship can come to shore. So transshipment terminals, they help with this. So they want to build a big transshipment terminal, which is basically a port. They want to build a big airport, some huge tourism facilities, and tourism facilities cater to like the 5-star crowd.
Right.
And so this is basically the plan.
Two
Uh,
cities and a solar plant,
Yeah,
solar and
solar,
gas plant, which is
solar and gas combined,
16,000
they say.
hectares.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is basically the plan. There's a huge disconnect between what the government is calling development, and they're bringing in national security angles also. So they are saying China and all that, and they're saying we need this. But if you talk to people, which I have been doing for a long time now, um, their developmental needs are so much. Um, they're very different from what the government thinks of as development. This is what my recent reporting also showed, among other things. I'll come to my recent report, but a little bit of history. So, if you talk to any average citizen, Indian citizen in cities on about Nicobar Islands, Andaman Nicobar, they'll probably tell you about Port Blair, or like or on some trip that they went to there.
Havelock.
But apart from this, no, not many people know who are the people there, what is their history. So it was I was very fortunate to find a Nicobarese anthropologist.
Yeah.
So he's not an anthropologist from somewhere else. He's from one of the Nicobar Islands. He's from Car Nicobar. He's from the community, and also he says this has helped me. My anthropology, it has helped me study my own people. And it's great to have that perspective of someone who's from the community, who has studied the history in that island, who's also an academic, and who's a government officer because he was with the Anthropological Survey of India, and he served there for many years. So I did an interview with him. This was for Article 14, and it was very interesting. So I would urge everyone to go and read the story because I would never be able to communicate what he communicated in the way he communicated it. And there is so much more that he told me that's not there in that report. But basically, he talks about the history of the islands, of the people. So Great Nicobar has two tribes, Shompen and Nicobaris.
Quickly, just to quick interruption. So these reports are available in Article 14.
Yeah.
There's some of the most recent reports that Rishika has filed. So please go and check that out. You'll find it on her Twitter timeline, or go to Article 14. Friends of ours. Yeah.
Thank you. I reported one for News Minute also.
Oh.
So this was when so this plan entails a lot of biodiversity destruction. So to compensate for destruction of biodiversity, so they denotified 2 sanctuaries. So to compensate for destruction of those sanctuaries, they declared 3 other sanctuaries. But the 3 other sanctuaries were places where the local tribal community used to go for fishing, or they used to have their coconut plantations on. And if you declare them as a sanctuary, people will lose their rights of access. So I reported this for News Minute about how the tribal council in Great Nicobar, they have objected to the declaration of a sanctuary because obviously their rights would be curtailed. And this is just crazy, right? This is the government destroying Galatia Bay Sanctuary because of this huge port which no one asked for. No one there asked for it. No one there wants it. They have protested against it. And then, so that is the first level of injustice that happens to them. The second level is then you declare 3 other sanctuaries on islands where the people have been using for coconut plantations, for fishing, whatever.
This is not
else.
the Great Nicobar Island. This is some other island.
Yeah.
So this is some kind of
What?
carbon offset kind of logic, right? Which is
Yeah, just destroy somewhere else, compensate somewhere else, and you think it's done. Yeah, I mean that's a whole carbon. That's a whole other.
we'll
crazy
get into
story.
that. I
Yeah.
hope to discuss that as well. But now, again, for people watching who might not be very aware about the issue, we are talking about the Greater Nicobar Island, which is what, about 900 square kilometers.
Yeah.
So to give you a perspective, Bangalore is what, 700 square kilometers. Hyderabad is about 1,000 square kilometers. So we're talking about an island the size of about somewhere in between Bangalore and Hyderabad. That's the size of the island. Whereas the human population there is just in the hundreds. You have the Nicobarese tribe, and then you have the Shompen.
And then you have the settlers also, because many people from the mainland, they were settled. So these were ex-military people.
Oh.
They were settled in the 70s, 80s, 60s. During that time, they were settled, the first batch.
Why military people?
The government just settled ex-military men on the islands. I'm not sure what the thinking behind it was. But those were the first batch of settlers,
ex-military. And what do they do? And they make a living
so
out
some of them. And with that, commercial activities also came. And then there were many other laborers who also migrated from many parts. There are people from South India, there are people from Bengal. There are
You're talking about
places.
The Andamans as a whole. You're talking about the
Great Nicobar also, and this also. So even
because I know in the
Nicobar
Andamans there's been some very how do I put it? I would even say mean-minded population resettlement projects where refugees from Bangladesh were thrown in there, and very sad stories over there. But the Great Nicobar Island, you were saying,
also has a settler population. So there are again they are ex-military men from the mainland, and then after that, many laborers also migrated because for work. People in India move everywhere for work, right? So then some laborers also went there from all across India, from southern states, from northeastern, eastern states, North Indian states.
So that population is about what?
I think a few thousand. So there's no census now, so I don't know exactly how many numbers there are. But then the tribal community is still a minuscule population if you take the whole together.
The Shompen is what? Just 200 individuals?
I think maybe 500
because their numbers dipped after the tsunami, I heard.
A few of them died.
Yeah.
But I don't know. So it's very difficult to put a number on it because, first of all, Shompen said they are semi-nomads. They move around a lot. Unless a researcher has gone there specifically to count how many people there are, you wouldn't know. It's a few hundreds, I would say. Both Nicobaris and Shompen, a few hundreds.
So the Nicobaris, who are slightly, they're not a particularly vulnerable tribal group, but in the sense that they have experienced some contact with the outside world to the extent that some of them are Christian, and there's a faith that this is based on your report, a faith they practice which combines animism and Christianity, whereas the Shompen are far more shy. They have no real contact with.
Yeah, so Shompen, they are forest dwellers basically. They still live in the forest. The Nicobaris, on the other hand, are slightly more contemporary. That's what the anthropologist, that's the word he used. They are slightly more contemporary. Not like us, definitely nothing like Bangalore, but slightly more. So the Shompen, it is completely...
Perhaps not even as, modern. I don't know, I use that word, with a caveat, but as some, say, a Malay Kudia or a Jain Kuruba or a Koraga, even these people have far greater contact than someone like a Nicobarese.
I think it's probably similar.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I would put them on the same level.
Okay.
In terms of access to many modern hospitals or education, because both of them are screwed. Both the groups don't get the kind of access that all of us have. But Shompen, on the other hand, so the one point that this person I spoke to, the anthropologist, kept stressing is they are least concerned with the administration, with the Andaman Nicobar administration, and they are least concerned with development. They don't even want it. We don't know if they really want anything more because they largely dwells within the forest. Sometimes they come out, but very rarely. And so
we haven't yet deciphered their language.
Their language, yeah. We have
So-
no idea what the Shompen language is.
So then what happens to notification, consultation? So the process of notification for land involves consultation with the
Yeah.
local population, right? So how do you consult with the Shompen?
Yeah. So this is where our sophistication with law and all that it falls, right?
Yeah.
Because it can go up to a certain extent in ensuring rights, but apart from that, you just need to have the basic common sense that, look, this project cannot go ahead because we don't have consent. That is basic. So recently there was a huge exchange between Jairam Ramesh, who was the previous environment minister, and Bhupendra Yadav, who is the current minister. They wrote many letters to each other, and in one letter which Bhupendra Yadav, who is the current minister, wrote to Jairam Ramesh, it was I think 5 or 7 pages. Very sophisticated language, and he talks about a lot of things. He talks about how all constitutional safeguards for tribal communities have been taken care of. There are some. I mean, it feels silly to even get into it because there's no
Please.
consent.
Yeah.
I
okay.
mean, you don't know these people, you don't know
Right.
their language. So what are you talking? Like, what are you talking about constitution safeguards? So if you just remove that word constitution safeguards and you talk about consent, like come directly to the point that you want to make, that you think you're taking consent from these people and you haven't, because you don't even know their language. There was no way to tell them about a mega project. How would you tell them? So yeah, there can be no consent. So even that's what the person also stressed, that how do you tell them about this mega project? And also the Nicobaris have protested against it. They have written letters. There are letters written by the tribal council in Nicobar saying we don't want this project. Our consent was taken by force. So the administration took their letter for diversion of forest land. But that NOC, no objection certificate, that was taken without telling them what it really is. So then they withdrew their consent.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
That's
Across
happened elsewhere.
India.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your report had it. There were these hyperlinks
Yeah.
here, and here.
Yeah.
Saying that when you were referring to this part where you said, consent, yes, but is it informed consent? Is it, even a legal process that they followed?
They
and then
did.
quickly you put in brackets saying that there are other examples
Yes.
in mainland
Yeah.
India.
That
Now,
where this has happened.
that is something I want to pick on. So you are a freelance journalist. You don't have the safety net that even someone like me does. We are, of course, struggling as a news outlet. Our jobs are far less secure as journalists than things were in, say, even 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about your trials as a freelance journalist, trying to look at environment, right? Because, okay, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of people who I know who do an environment journalist tend to be hobbyists in the sense that, they like traveling, they like green spaces, and along they take a pen and a camera along, right? But you're a professional climate and environment, climate justice kind of person who looks at these things. How difficult is it for you to get these stories out? What do you think the present ecosystem in terms of our outlets, alternate media, mainstream media? Give us a sense of this landscape, your trials as a reporter.
I think I've been one of the fortunate few as a freelancer also. So so 2 levels, right? So one freelancer, second is I've chosen in the environment beat. But I have been one of the lucky fews that I have found outlets that are willing to publish these stories, that are enthusiastic about publishing these stories.
No, we are also enthusiastic about publishing your stories.
Yeah,
we
I've
just don't have the money
published
to give you to commission those stories. So
yeah. Okay. So I mean, yeah, I think media is evolving. I think many more people are taking an interest in these stories. But as a freelancer, it is still challenging to get a travel grant to travel to Nicobar, for example. So I've been trying this for like a year now. And I think now I'm at a point where I'm saying, okay, I'll put my own money and go, because I want to live there also for a while, not just go there for like 2-3 days for a story, because I did this last year also. So last year I was in Uttarakhand for about 4 months and completely my own money. I just wanted to go there because I wanted to track Wildlife Institute of India. They are based in Dehradun. So I wanted to track that institute. I wanted to track Forest Survey of India because every year they keep saying forest cover has increased. It has not. There's not a problem with the way they say, they map and they say what they say. So I wanted to track these two institutes, and I wanted to understand Himalayas, ecology, climate change, and also Van Gujars. So Van
Right.
Gujars there, they keep getting eviction notice. The current Dhami government, extremely communal. They have said they'll bring in land jihad laws where they specifically want. So Van Gujars, so they are a Muslim tribal community, and they are pastoral. So being pastoral, because they travel a lot, it's difficult to get Forest Rights Act. So pastoral, Muslim, tribal. It's a horrible mix of three vulnerabilities. So I wanted to understand what's happening with them also. And I went there and I was there for about 3-4 months.
What
I
happened?
did a few reports.
Yeah.
So, then I had to come back to Bangalore for some work. But yeah, the
So
point.
what did you see? I mean, I want to know what you saw over there. I'll come back to, of course,
Yeah.
this journalism question.
Yeah.
But yeah, what happened with the Van Gujars? What stories
Yeah,
did you
I'm
file?
not reported that yet.
Okay.
I'm yet to finish that story. But actually, I had gone there to attend an event where they were felicitating some students, some Van Gujar students, because they had cleared their exams. Some 8th, some 7th, some 10th. So it was a very small ceremony. I had gone there just to attend. And there I made friends, and then I stayed with them. And then we were traveling around just to see other various Gujar bastis. And one basti we went to, there was an old lady who was showing us the eviction notice she got just 2 or 3 days before we went there. And so the government is just randomly giving eviction notices, randomly telling them to get out.
Targeted at the Van Gujars.
Yeah. And also the government has, and this has been reported in the Hindi, the local media there, that they want to bring in a land jihad law, and they want to give imprisonment terms of almost 10 years. This is specifically targeted at them because they are talking about forest encroachment, and they have been destroying some sacred sites of the Muslim communities also there.
And I would imagine they would be practicing, again, a combination of animist or tribal faiths and Islam and Sufi.
I guess so. I have not particularly explored this angle
Right.
of what their faith is like. But yeah, I guess so, yeah. So yeah, I want to go back there and I want to
How
finish
much
that
did your
story.
trip cost last time when you went there?
It's a lot because I moved houses 3-4 times because I was staying in
put up
different.
there. You
Yeah,
took up
I
a place
stayed there. So
Okay. How many
initially
weeks were you there?
I was there for almost 4 months, 3.5, 4 months.
And it set you back by? No, these are important
no.
conversations to have,
Yeah,
okay?
yeah,
To
so-
give people an
So
understanding.
rent, I mean, if you take in rent,
Hmm.
I think I shouldn't consider rent because that was very bad decision making on my side because I thought I'll take an Airbnb, I'll go stay there, then I'll look for a cheaper accommodation. I got an Airbnb, I stayed there for some, I think maybe 5-10 days. That was very expensive. Then when that was very remote also, this was outskirts of Dehradun in some hill. For my grocery, I had to go to a different hill.
Right.
It was impractical also, and it was very away from these institutes that I wanted to track. And obviously, Gujar Bastis, the ones that I knew, they were somewhere else. So then I moved houses closer to Dehradun city, but even that didn't really work out. Then I moved to the house in front of that house. Again, very poor decision making. So I wish I had planned this better before going there.
You can't.
But-
No, how do you plan? So, for example, I went to.
Yeah.
Okay, so last year I did a bunch of stories on the growth of Hindutva in these districts near Salem, Hosur, these parts. Okay, because it was right here, I could drive up, but it still took me 6-7 trips. The first trip was just random.
Yeah.
It's a recce trip. Then you do some reading. Then you find out who are the important sources there. Then you come back. It is not as simple as just landing up. Okay, this is the issue. This is the story.
Yeah.
So 4 months would cost, at the very least, about $1.5 lakh
Yes.
of
I think
rupees.
I think a lakh around
And that's
for rent,
yeah.
flight rent, and once I had to come back to Bangalore because I had some work here and then go back. So if you take the flight and the rent, and even there traveling, so there I would use just bus.
You know what I'm working towards, right? I'm basically, working towards a pitch over here. So if you want Rishika to go to an Andamans or a Uttarakhand and get a report, and if we have to commission someone like her, that's how much it'll cost. At least just for stay and food, it costs about $1 lakh rupees.
Yeah,
for
I
you to
think
be
for
deployed.
a month it would. So I've actually done the math for Nicobar. I think for a month it would take me about maybe 50,000.
50,000.
I mean, a month including flight and ship to and fro. So and
It's just travel.
travel. No, I stay also. It's very
Mm.
cheap there. So
Okay.
there's a guest house. There's a local, like a panchayat guest house. So that's very cheap, and even food, I don't eat much.
Okay.
So,
Okay, this is the starting of this discussion. If you really, care about what's happening in the Great Nicobar Island, with the particularly vulnerable tribal group over there, Rishika is right here. Let's see if we can raise some money. Right now, as this production is going on, I mean, in the production team itself, we have a person who's very interested in environmental issues, Bhuvan. You might have noticed his reporting from Manipur. That again was you see these hybrid models
yeah,
emerging,
yeah,
right, Rishika?
yeah,
I mean, where
and
we put out these kind of calls, get
yeah.
people to participate in our journalism. That also keeps us on the straight and narrow in terms of our reporting.
Hmm.
But these are the new evolving models.
Yeah.
Please, if you think that it's going to be worth the effort, let's start a conversation about that. But now, the Great Nicobar Island, you're talking about the Himalayas. There are all these vulnerable eco-sensitive zones. The one thing that is, I suppose, common to these zones is the people who are living there. Uh, Invariably from the lower strata, economically, definitely not upper caste, except in the case of something like a Joshimat, where that place had many.
Yeah.
It's a Brahmin dominated bunch of villages, but largely you will see that the land which is sliding, we're talking about the rising waters and land vanishing. The people who are standing on that cliff between water and land are invariably people who are also on the margins of society, right? How do you, as a reporter, bring people into the discourse of environmentalism? Because we do have a history of a lot of environmental movements or environmentalists who seem to be, how do I put it, ecocentric in that sense. There's a difference between ecocentrism and environmentalism, right? How do you juggle these considerations as a reporter? Because it's all about the gaze, isn't it?
I think, yeah. So if your entry point into the Nicobar story, for example,
Hmm.
is about consent, if the entry point is about land, um, then you will invariably include all of it. So there's also Galathea Bay Sanctuary, where the giant leatherback turtle, where that is an endangered species, and that habitat will go away if this project comes up. And even I have reported about it. I've reported about the biodiversity threat that this project poses, the wildlife that could get completely destroyed because of this project. But I've also reported about these people. I think in every landscape, I think this is true. It's true for Bangalore also, because Bangalore is not just upper caste rich people. Bangalore, anywhere you go, you will find informal settlements. You will find slum dwellers. So I wouldn't even write off cities completely, because cities also have many places and many people who are vulnerable to climate, whatever other environmental issue.
But even in
Uh,
cities, I mean, just a small thing, segue,
yeah.
if you allow me. The cities also have this segregated settlements,
Yes. Yeah.
right? In fact, my brother Sumanto Mondal, he looked at the topography of Bangalore. He did a study based on mean sea level and where different neighborhoods lie in relation to other in terms of elevation, and found that lowered caste areas are also low lying,
Yeah.
which means when flooding happens, water is invariably going into those places and inundating them. The exception would be like a white field, or some Sarjapur neighborhood which is built on a bank, on a lake. Apart from that, largely in cities also you're seeing that these particularly vulnerable groups are at the edge of the climate crisis.
Yeah, so I think I would completely agree with what you said, that many people come into this with a purely environmental lens, and you end up further marginalizing the people, because in your focus on environment and climate, you again end up marginalizing them more, because you're not taking them into account at all. So that has happened a lot. Yes. um, I mean, I think it's easy to center people, right? Like, so if I go to Nicobar Islands, I would be fascinated by what their history is anthropologically, where they come, what they do, what they worship. Uh, so for me personally, it is fascinating. Also, it is obviously a justice issue. It's also interesting. And yeah, I think nowadays more environmental reporters, more climate reporters are focusing on the justice angle.
You think there was less of that in the past?
I think so.
There was
I
this
would say that. Yeah.
greater obsession with the flora
With
and the fauna.
yeah.
Mm.
But I would say that with climate, even from the 90s, so the climate treaty was signed in 1992, the Climate Change Convention. Even then, global south countries, including specifically India, always spoke about equity, warming in an unequal world. So in the 90s, when this came up, many global south countries still brought up the issue of, okay, what happens to our development then? Because you have developed, you have caused emissions. That's what has brought us to this point today. Now we want to develop, but there's a constraint. We agree that climate is a problem, emissions are a problem, but what do we do? Then concept of climate finance and equity on all this came up. So climate also has a very strong history in justice. I would say even environment does, because if you read Shekhar Pathak's book on Chipko, I wish I had this book as part of my school syllabus, because when I studied about Chipko, it was just environment. It was environment completely removed from land rights or whatever else. But if you read Shekhar Pathak's book, you will know that it was environment, but it was also so many other things. And even so, even environmental movements in India have been historically for what? For forest rights, for land rights. People protesting against some big project which will take over their land and their forest resources. So even environmental movements, especially in global south countries or even in global north countries on indigenous lands, have always been tied to the larger struggle. But yeah, some people end up focusing only on the environment, only on emissions, and then you end up marginalizing a lot of other issues and people also.
And from an outsider perspective, as readers of reports such as yours, in a zoomed out bird's eye view, you find that on one side, the most vulnerable tribal groups, their biggest, like in a city, if you ask a Dalit who's your biggest enemy in the bureaucracy, they'll easily say the BBMP fellow and the cop, right? If you ask the same question of somebody living in a Bastar, or in if you ask the Dongriya Kond, or if you ask the Malaykudiyas of Western Ghats, they will say forest department, right? So you have a very I want your view on this. I'm using this word, correct me if this word is correct or wrong. You have this almost activist forest department, which believes that humans are the enemy of the trees and the birds and the animals, and they treat tribal groups very harshly. There is detention, there is beating, there's been instances of sexual violence, and joining concert with them. Sometimes, in the case of the Western Ghats, are people in the anti-Naxal force. There's that element also, because these are also areas where Naxals have been active. So you see one very big part of the bureaucracy conducting itself in this manner, and then you have these kind of notifications of which you saw in the Great Nicobar Island. You have different places where very eco-sensitive zones are notified, and this seems to be a left-hand right-hand thing of the same beast. While you're answering that, can you do this question and this dichotomy? Can you talk about the amendment to the forest conservation amendment, which happened? You wrote about it. This happened in March 23. And one of the things that you said by way of commentary, there's very, very little commentary in your reportage. I must congratulate you for steering clean of commentary. But one of the things you do still say is that the previous legislation, this is a completely new legislation. The previous legislation was about how do you safeguard the forest, whereas the present is to find different ways of what is permissible inside a forest. Right? Can we do this? Not this much, but little bit. Can we do a greenfield airport in a Nicobar Island? Comes from some this kind of thinking, right? Which is that we can liberalize these lands a little bit. Not everywhere. We don't need to have those strict laws everywhere. So on one side you have the tribal people who are facing these really strict laws. Tell me about this and all of this.
So about forest bureaucracy, so a lot of people attribute it to colonial vestiges. So we inherited the forest bureaucracy from how the British governed forests. So the British basically governed the forest for fuel wood. They wanted wood.
Timber.
So it was all timber based. Not fuel wood, timber, correct. So it was basically all the plantations that we have now. Many people do it. And it's true. So to a large extent, this whole obsession with plantations.
Tea plantations,
it comes from
plantations.
It comes from that mindset of, okay, productivity, forests, wood. And the same kind of tools were used against the communities also, forest dwelling communities also, because it was very enforcement driven. It was either forests have to be pristine landscapes or they have to be productive for timber.
This is in
And
the
this is
British
just the
era.
Huh?
This is in the British era, you mean?
Yeah.
So there was a concept
This-
of conservation back then also, you're saying?
No, I wouldn't say it's conservation.
Conservation for exploitation. Okay.
So then when we established the forest bureaucracy, a lot of this was inherited, but that was a choice, right? You don't just do this just because you inherited it. Now it has been so long and it is still happening. So there's something deeper than just okay, we inherited this from the British. Like that question needs more investigation than just saying, okay, we inherited it, that's what it is. Because in many cases it is the forest department actively taking control of these lands, which were community lands before. And in many cases it is the forest department raising plantations. In many cases it is the forest department using enforcements very selectively. So if a industry comes up and they seek permit, those permits are always given. No, forest department will not object, state government will not object, central government will not object. But if it is a forest rights claim, then many questions come up. So yeah, I think it's a part of it is the inheritance from what our laws were under the British. A part of it is also them actively seeking to control and maintain these lands for whatever purposes they see fit. About Forest Conservation Amendment, so for people who didn't follow it, so there's this act called Forest Conservation Act. Again, there are many criticisms of it, all that is fine. But basically what the act does is it tries to regulate forest diversions. So if you want to so it doesn't ban diversion. So everyone should know this. Forest Conservation Act doesn't mean you're not allowed to divert any land. You are allowed, but with some safeguards. You have to apply for permissions. You have to say how you will divert the land, what other mechanisms you will ensure that. And even some compensatory afforestation, all that will come up. Many conditions are there. So you can still apply to divert land under Forest Conservation Act, but like even community consent is a part of it. You have to take consent from the local people, otherwise you can't divert. So it has links with the FRA also, with Forest Rights Act also. So you can divert land, but ensure that all these conditions are met. So what the government did the government amended many things under the Forest Conservation Act, but the biggest amendment was, so before there were these deemed forest lands. They would invariably be classified as forest lands for which you require Forest Conservation Act. Now the government did away with that whole classification, and now if it's not explicitly notified, you don't have to apply for a diversion application under Forest Conservation Act. So if there are in many states there are some lands which are ecologically fragile, but they're not explicitly notified as a sanctuary or a forest area or a forest reserve, whatever. But before, this would still be protected because the act went by the definition, the dictionary definition of a forest. So before, all that you needed for this law to apply was that it met the dictionary meaning of what a forest is, which is basically any parcel of land with some amount of tree cover, forest cover. A general dictionary definition of what a forest is. But now
the
that
woods,
doesn't apply.
like you would say.
So and that's a very wide definition. It covers even grasslands, for example. It covers many non-forest, but which are ecologically sensitive areas.
Pallikarnai marsh, for example.
Yeah, or even Hesarghatta in Bangalore. So these are all ecologically sensitive areas. So the act would cover all of this just because it is dictionary definition. Now they did away with that. They said only those which are officially notified and officially classified as forests will be covered.
That is less than 5%.
It's even less. So it's
which means reserve forests, sanctuaries.
Yeah.
What, rivers?
Only those are, yeah, and at the state level also some are classified as not reserve forests. I think even Hesarghatta would be covered in some state level notifications or some it would still be recognized in any government document basically.
So I reported in coastal Karnataka you have these sacred groves, and community forests.
Yeah.
On Kumki land. Kumki land is basically government land, but it is open to use by the public commons. Many of these grasslands and commons. These are all now under threat after 23, you're saying.
unless they find some notification. So again, legally, the people are still exploring it, because if it is classified somewhere
No, it's
in some
privately
gazette.
owned. Many of these. So okay, there's Kumki
Okay.
land, of course. Say, so you have these Bhutastanas in coastal
Yeah.
Karnataka, where the Daiva or the animist
Yeah,
deity,
yeah.
this thing, and surrounding it is a couple of acres of land, which could be granted by a private entity to a public trust. Let's even say, so that Bhutastana would have a trust. So these are not, and to the site, like you said in the previous notification, by site, this is as thick a forest as you would find anywhere in the country.
Yeah, but they're not officially notified, so it wouldn't be covered by the Forest Conservation Act. After the amendment, it won't be covered. Before it was.
So what, they're going to be treated just as revenue land now?
So it won't make a difference unless someone applies for a diversion. So if someone approaches the state government saying they want to divert this land, you can just divert without any of the conditions that Forest Conservation Act previously required, including community consent and including other safeguards.
It's so interesting you mentioned this. Yeah, I keep going back, because the only time I did some environmental reporting was back in coastal Karnataka in Mangalore.
Okay.
The Mangalore SEZ was coming up, and several other of these. There was something called the PCPRP, which is the petrochemical and petroleum chemicals. There's one industrial thing they were planning over there. One of the things that the activists were trying very hard to do is to protect these sacred groves. The thing they had to do first up was to prove that this was forest. So back then, and this is say 2007, 8, these are the years.
Okay.
So the fact that they had the option of saying that we can prove this as a forest, and therefore some of these safeguards would apply. But now,
It's gone.
yeah.
So imagine, so it was challenging even back then, even when it was covered by laws like Forest Conservation Act, because they had to still go ahead and prove that it's a forest, right? So even now now it's worse. There are many areas like this. So sacred groves, that is one part of it. If you go to the northeast, most of the land is still community owned. It's neither under the government.
Right.
So, and it was very interesting in the northeast, because
the Khasi
northeast,
Hills and
yeah. So even central laws like Forest Rights Act also don't apply in some places. It's both, right? It's forest conservation and forest. Like, I mean, both of it. Many central laws don't apply. It's a different kind of regime. So we need to first recognize that so many of these lands are community-owned lands. So many of these are still forest lands, and these kind of amendments to the law, they are done specifically to bypass whatever protections were there before, and especially community consent, because they can just do away with consent, and they know that consent was coming in the way of diversion, and this is one way to get rid of the consent, the legal procedures for consent.
The state and its attitude towards these things, it almost appears that the parties in the fray which make up the political system have a bipartisan kind of attitude towards these things, right? My question to you was going to be, this happened in 23, so what did Modi do? Is it the BJP? Is it more rapacious in its appetite for forest lands? No, set the record straight. I mean, where is the politics in this? Because both parties, the principal two parties in the country,
all political parties that form governments, they have an issue with autonomy, right? So tribal lands are autonomy. It comes from autonomy. So which government would willingly recognize autonomy? It's difficult.
And the autonomy of somebody who's electorally an ant. Considering these people
because
are
minuscule
elephants.
populations everywhere, they have minuscule populations.
You can't bite me.
But it is but we should still recognize that there are things like sixth schedule, which constitutionally ensure that, okay, in practice maybe it can go wrong, but you have to fight it out, whether in courts or with protests, petitions, whatever it is, you have to fight it out. But at least we have a constitution that recognizes sixth schedule. Actually, even this, the Nicobarese anthropologist spoke about this in my report also. He spoke about how for the Jaravas, so the Jaravas are again a tribal community in the islands, in the Andaman Islands. So for them, the official government policy at that time was maximum autonomy, minimum intervention. So you can still negotiate with the government. I mean, I know it's very difficult. I've not tracked the history of how this came up, how this government policy came up. Maybe some individuals were enthusiastic enough, they cared enough to actually go and set this policy. So he was talking about how the government policy was maximum autonomy, minimum intervention, and they did follow it for a while until it was broken. Until you had to build a road, the Andaman Trunk Road, through the Jarawa Tribal Reserve, which led to a lot of exploitation of the women, which led to a lot of deforestation also, encroachment also. And the people were coming in, encroaching forest lands. And the Jarawas are already a tribal community, a vulnerable community, and their lands were taken away. So I mean, I don't want to end on a pessimistic note saying the state is always antagonistic. Because, I mean, it has been. It is a very, very difficult battle, but at least we have things like sixth schedule, which people like Sonam Wangchuk are now fighting for, because they see they see it as a tool, right? If Ladakh is classified as sixth schedule, then they get their resources in their own hands. So it is still worth fighting for. It's not like, okay, that's it. There's nothing we can do because the state government wants all of the land. Because these kind of things, even Forest Conservation Act, Forest Rights Act, even Forest Rights Act, it is still the government recognizing community lands, right? And community ownership of community lands and forest resources. That's a huge deal. So even the fact that we have something like the Forest Rights Act is a huge deal. It is government recognizing local ownership. So this kind of negotiation with the government, I think that we have a long way to go, but it can be done. Yeah.
These negotiations with the government and these negotiations between governments.
Yeah.
I want to get to that quickly, because now we're getting into a season where back-to-back there are going to be two climate summits, one in Brazil, one in Azerbaijan. I want you to talk about that, what we should be looking out for in these international negotiations, what are the different lobbies and the discussions in play. Before that, I want to, obviously, I believe that when I asked you what's your ism, you said, oh, journalism. and that's why I'm not going to let you go on that, because I do feel like, journalists, including me, we all try to be objective to the extent that we try to be fair, but we have a perspective, we have some call it a gaze, some call it an ism, some call it, your ideology. The question really is, the philosophical question is, it appears in the whole spectrum of people who care about the environment, they can be broadly divided into two groups. Right, ecocentric people and environmentalists, right, which is what I spoke about earlier, or people who believe, let's even say you can divide them into people who are votaries of mitigation as opposed to people who are votaries of adaptability. And this question keeps coming up repeatedly in different contexts, in the context of how should we grow our crops, right? Should we look at mitigation, saying that no way, no more GM crops, because this is poisoning the soil and all of that? Or do you look at adaptability, you look at more resilient crops which need less pesticides or less poison in the ground? Tell me, mitigation or adaptability, ecocentrism, where you think that humans are not at the center of the conversation, the world and all its species are at the center of the conversation. Where do you stand on this? Which extremes do you sway to?
This is so difficult to answer. I mean, ideally, I would want the concept of ecology to come in, which includes people.
Where do we look? When I said it's philosophical, right? I really. So where do we look for answers for this kind of a question? Do you look for them in Marxism? Do you look for them in Ambedkarism? Marxism means you will say, oh well, today if there's anybody talking about environment and climate, Jal Jangal Jameen people are these. Fellows with guns in the forest, these rebels. Okay, apart from that, but then in the spiritual systems, your reporting again repeatedly highlights the spiritual frameworks of these vulnerable communities. Is that where some of the answers are?
So the spiritual aspect of it's there in many tribal communities. So I think nowadays many people think, okay, it's not very practical, that that frame of mind, it won't last long, it'll disappear in 10, 20 years maybe. I'm not a subscriber to that philosophy. I think many of us nowadays, we are trying to look for these kind of aspects because living in cities, it's not very fulfilling. I know many people who are going back to farming, who are going back to live in areas.
Those are all those US returned IT people.
It is true. That's true.
Yeah.
But why would they want to? So I have a neighbor who gave up. No, I have a neighbor who gave up a very, very cushy job at a MNC, and he took up farming now. He tried organic also. He's still doing some organic farming. He has suffered losses for 5 years. Why would you do that? You're trying to find some meaning, right? It's
Yeah,
not.
but I would also love to do it. On the TNM salary, I can't afford to do that.
So
you
no,
know.
but no. What I'm trying to say is that life was not fulfilling. So people are
No,
trying
no, of
to
course, of course.
get.
There is, if given a choice, sure. I mean, anyone would
Yeah.
love to.
And if there are communities that that are still living with some of these principles, I think we should recognize that and actually celebrate people who can teach us a lot more than what we know. And that's what I found with many of these communities also. And so they have a very nice local governance system as well, which I think governments can learn from. A local government system, whether it is for forest resources, how they manage it, how they ensure something is not extracted to extinction. I think we should explore our own Indian history, local histories, local tribal histories, even non-tribal also, about how people managed their own forest resources. Because I think that has huge lessons to how it could inform our
But
laws
how
and
they
laws.
managed each other is that is a result of how, I suppose, how they managed one another. Their social organizing
Yeah.
had an impact on these things. They have a
Yeah.
more sustainable social system,
Yes. Yeah. I would agree. Yeah.
more consultative
Yeah.
in that space, I suppose.
So, I mean, people build houses for each other. I've seen this in Meghalaya. So they would gather on a Sunday and they were building a house, like a bamboo house for a newly married couple. Who will do that here in Bangalore? So it is a more community-oriented system, and that's where management of everything came in, including forest resources.
Where do you stand on hazardous crops? Because one of the things we don't focus enough on in climate reporting is that one of the most ecologically disastrous activities in India, in a country agrarian economy like India, is actually agriculture, which takes the kind of inputs that go into keeping agriculture alive are disastrous, not just in terms of what irrigation requirements are there, and but also in terms of the cost of production, which involves fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. The high yielding varieties are also duds in the sense that you cannot use those seeds again. You have to buy another set of seeds, and all of this is justified in the name of what? We're trying to solve the hunger question.
I mean, you can give better prices to farmers. So productivity is one way to improve farmers' income, but give them better prices and even that will improve income. Like, how much are you trying to squeeze out of that land which you cannot sustain for a longer period?
It's also killing the land.
Yeah, it's also killing the land.
And we still have pesticide subsidies in this country.
Yeah. So judicious use of fertilizers, pesticides, definitely yes. We need that to even sustain the crops. So if it can't sustain, so before we had seeds which sustain for generations, the same seeds, and now I don't know. So yeah, definitely we need that to rethink for agriculture. I wouldn't bring in agriculture into the climate thing because I mean many people do talk about methane emissions, rice.
The US is trying to get us to now. So first, America pushed this entire thing of these genetically modified varieties of rice. MS Swaminathan and these people, they brought this green revolution into into India and similar characters in different parts of Southeast Asia, and now the same country, and that was done as part of a much larger geopolitical game to counter the influence of Chinese communism. Philippines, they were communists. They were Laos, Cambodia. These communist revolutions were happening. In response to which, America comes up with this thing: let's deal in food. This is happening mostly in countries which are insecure about food production. So let's do this entire Frankensteinian, project of creating genetically modified, high-yielding varieties. All of this happens, right? Now, suddenly, the same country is saying that India should sign now the methane pledge. Why? Because paddy, this rice thing, is the greatest contributor to methane emissions in the world.
Yeah. So I don't know about the geopolitics of green revolution, and I mean, to some extent, maybe at that time you needed food security. It has come at a cost now. So now we're at a point where we need to rethink the kind of fertilizers, pesticides we use.
Monocropping.
Yeah, all that. So, I mean, I don't think anyone now would question the need for sustainability in agriculture. But don't do it by putting a carbon tax or a methane pledge on the farmer. So in India, what 85% farmers are small and marginal, less than 1 acre. So what are we trying to achieve? And by placing burden on whom? So climate narratives can go completely haywire if you say, okay, livestock, rice, methane.
Hmm. Yeah.
So India, again, so you should also look at country realities. So India, we don't have industrial agriculture like how the US and European countries have. So even subsidies, they subsidize their farmers many times over than what we do. And if you see any kind of farmer statistic in India, whether it is about how much land holding they have or suicide rates, like check farmer suicide rates, it's horrible. And I see these op-eds in newspapers sometimes saying carbon tax agriculture. Like, what are these guys talking from? Which world are you bringing these narratives and where are you imposing them? So you need to first, so any climate report, I have said this multiple times in many places also. First, you recognize, you learn about your country first. You recognize what the country realities are, and then you start talking about what solutions can work where. Because if you bring in methane emissions, if you bring in carbon dioxide emissions, and you talk about that when it comes to farmers, I mean, no, that's just not how you do it. Completely inequitable, placing burden exactly on the opposite, on the wrong people. I mean, but this doesn't mean that we need to cut down on fertilizer use, pesticide use it more judiciously. Because that is again keeping the farmer in mind, right? Like if the land goes away in like 4 or 5 years, if there's nothing left, then what will the farmer also do? So there is a need. I've seen like too many of these narratives where you just bring in something from some methane pledge from some US or European country and you try to do that here. That will not work, because that's not what our conditions are like. This is not some industrial agriculture, or even so milk production also, whatever it is. So it is still, pastoralists are still like small livelihoods here in India. So you can't just bring in global narratives and just apply it blanket here.
Hmm. And these are the areas, once again, I think so much more reporting is required to bring out these textures. It is not so simple as the binary that I started asking you about, saying, is it ecocentrism, is it environmentalism? But just to cover this much ground, it's already an hour, and I still have so many questions left. What I'll do is, like I gave the disclaimer right in the beginning, and saying that this is an elementary discussion. This is the first discussion we're having on environmentalism and climate change and things like that. So Rishika, give our audience a sense of some of the important upcoming discussions, right? So the first thing is what's going to happen in Brazil, what's on the agenda, what is the Indian position, and how do you problematize that space? I mean, how India in response to some of the lobbies from the West and what they're demanding.
Okay.
So what's happening in Brazil?
So okay, we'll start off with Azerbaijan.
Okay,
that's
start with
first.
Azerbaijan.
So
Okay.
that's coming in November.
Okay.
Then Brazil is December. So Azerbaijan is the climate conference. So this happens every year. These are annual negotiations. And this year, a big theme is climate finance. So global South countries, developing countries, they have until now at least have had a collective position saying it's high time that the global North pays, and they should tell us how much exactly, like quantum, how much exactly,
almost,
how much exactly that they will pay for us to undertake mitigation, adaptation, whatever our needs are, our climate needs are. So climate finance is the big theme for Azerbaijan, for Baku in Azerbaijan this year. And in Brazil, it's the biodiversity COP. So there in biodiversity, it's a multiplicity of issues. One issue is carbon markets, because there has been a lot of reporting about how the way that these markets function, it is screwing both biodiversity and community rights again. So I think this will be up for discussion both.
And biodiversity is, I suppose, where they'll get into discussions about agriculture and
agriculture also. But I'm
so these
I'm
methane
not
emissions and all this will come
that
up?
is under climate itself.
Achha.
So this year I don't think there's been a big focus on methane. I've not seen it. I mean, it'll be in some tracks. So agriculture is a track under the climate negotiations also. It comes up every year. And India, at least until now, India, and I think this position will remain, that India has said that you keep agriculture out of mitigation. Mitigation meaning cutting down emissions. Because in our country, this is whatever reality I spoke about, that is our farmers. We don't want to burden them with emission targets. So keep agriculture out of mitigation. And that has been India's stance on agriculture and climate, and even on generally on climate,
But
the global south.
as a trade-off, India is now introducing carbon credits, where
So-
they're going to put more pressure on larger industries, particularly coal, steel,
Yeah,
petrochemicals,
yeah.
where they're going to give them the option of trading credits. Is that a way of balancing things out, you think? Saying that leave the agricultural class aside, but we will try and focus more on the industrial class.
So carbon markets and carbon trading has taken off globally also. It has gone on full speed. It's like billions
been
of
a little
dollars.
late in coming into India, right?
Yeah. Here also, Nirmala Sitharaman, I think recently in the budget, she spoke about India's move towards establishing a domestic carbon market. So until now, we had efficiency standards. So industries were given efficiency targets, energy efficiency.
And subsidies.
Then that's all that we had. But now we'll have a full-fledged trading kind of system.
Just
credit
explain
trading.
this system, no, please. What does carbon trading mean? How does it work? What's the logic behind
So
it?
I don't know what India's plans will be because we have not chalked that out yet. It's not finalized yet. But broadly, there are many ways to do it. So, for example, if you want the fossil fuel industry, for example, to cut down emissions, you can set a cap. You can say that, okay, take this industry has to cut down emissions by this much, or emissions can't go beyond this point, or whatever. You set a target. And if an industry achieves that target, or if an industry's emissions are lesser than that target, that industry can, or that factory, or that whatever, that company can trade the extra ones. So if the target is this much and you manage to bring it down much below that, you can actually trade. You can trade those credits to someone who hasn't met the target, who has who has crossed the threshold. So between those companies, they can be trading. So a company which has met targets, company which is not, they can trade with each other.
And the complication here comes from the fact that these greener technologies, which can be used to reduce your emissions, are also more expensive.
Yes.
As a result, these expensive technologies can only work in economies of scale, which means you have a large Tata, group of industries which is into iron and steel. It will work for them, but not to some sponge iron unit in Ballari.
Yeah, that's
So the
true.
sponge iron unit in Bellary can buy credit points from Tata.
So this is one thing we need to be, because MSMEs, like I hope the final policy design takes into account that it can't apply equally to all. You can't have the same standard for MSMEs that you do for a big conglomerate or an MNC. We don't know what the policy finally will be. But yeah, so this is again equity, right? So equity happens global north, global south, and within India also,
exactly.
whether it is farmers, MSMEs, whatever it is. So I hope that is taken into account. And the other kind of trading that you can do is, so if a company wants to buy credits, they can also buy from maybe forest protection or forest sink. So if there's
afforestation
for
that turned into a bit of a
carbon
scam,
sink.
no? Because
It's a lot of
I've heard so many scams like this. So this is when so I was in the US in 2009 when the subprime crisis was happening, and one of the big conversations there was this carbon footprint offsets, which meant that you could be taking down a rainforest in Brazil as long as you planted a few trees in some Eastern European country. You could trade your carbon points, and that itself is, if it's not problematic enough, that you can replace an artificial forest with a real forest in
two different geographies.
The scam came sometimes from the fact that there was no forest in Eastern Europe, that it was just on paper. Right? Is something like this? Is that how the policy?
Yeah. So and now there are these. There are scams on a whole lot of things. Okay, so one kind of scam is what you talk about. The forest doesn't even exist, or maybe we have no way of really tracking if carbon sink capacity has increased or not. If it has increased, and is it because of this protection scheme that you introduced? So that's called additionality. So if there's already a forest there, and you want to buy credits for it, you should first make sure that you satisfy the additionality condition. Additionality means if the carbon sink right now is, maybe take it as 10 gigatons. That's already the sink capacity right now, 10 gigatons.
Okay, too much science. Explain properly. Simple terms. I think I'm just some 8th standard
so
student.
Additionality is like you have to show that because of the protection measure that you introduced, the forest sink capacity has increased. Because you can't take credit for forest sink that was there for many, many years. So if you as a company, so you're an airline company, you have many emissions, you have huge emissions, right? You're as an airline company. So you want to offset that. And you want to offset that by investing in a forest protection scheme. But that forest already existed. So what you have to show is that because of your additional protection, in whatever way you are giving, whether you want to undertake afforestation or you want to undertake a forest fire protection kind of scheme, so you have to show how your scheme improves or adds to the carbon sink capacity.
How do you
So if
measure
it was, yeah, that's the problem, right? So it's the tracking of it is very, very difficult. Showing this that the capacity has increased or not. And forest fire is a huge thing to try to contain. So how secure are these schemes really? And also the other problem which I have reported on personally from India also is there were these schemes undertaken in Himachal Pradesh. Himachal and one more state I forgot. One of those Himalayan states only. I think Uttarakhand. Where they invested for a carbon-oriented afforestation scheme. But the lands that were taken over were pastoral lands where people used to do grazing. So now you undertook afforestation, you destroyed those grasslands when people can't use those grasslands anymore. And some areas were fenced off.
So if you destroy
So-
that grassland and you
Put a
compensate somewhere else, the fact that you've also taken away someone's lifestyle,
forest. Yeah.
how do you compensate for that?
Yeah,
And,
that- yeah.
Cultural rights,
So
let's say.
there are too many reports journalistically and then globally within India also that show the loopholes of these offset schemes. Offsets, they have been mired in many scams.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
And even if you do away with the whole scam, the malintent part of it, even then it is difficult because
Yeah.
how do you
Track it.
measure? Yeah.
Measure.
So that is a huge problem. Yeah.
Right. Rishika, I've exceeded the hour. I hope I have asked you some questions which kind of forced you to dive deep into your area of work and expertise. Take a minute if you want. Tell me, what topics do you think we should have discussed and what we should discuss next time? And that's a question not just to you, but to the people watching as well. I'm putting my hand up and saying there's a lot I can learn about climate justice and environmental journalism and that whole conversation. If this was a conversation starter, please write in and tell us if it was good enough. What are the topics I left out? What are the topics I should discuss with Rishika when I have her here next time? So do please write in with your comments. But Rishika, you might want to
No,
flag
I
a few
think-
things that we didn't discuss that we should next time.
Yeah. So no, I think this was great. It was in how much we explored so many issues at length. This was great. This was a great first conversation. More, I would say the international negotiations, because that usually happens on a whole other scale. And even as a reporter, when I cover this, I know how much of a disconnect I am with my otherwise general audience. So even people who follow my environmental reporting, even they feel cut off when I talk about COP negotiations, because it is happening on a whole other planet. Well, it does seem like it's happening on a whole other planet. So international negotiations, that is one, I think. And I think it needs more scrutiny from journalists, from media houses, News Minute, whoever else wants to dive in. I think that space is... there's so much happens that happens there. And these are very powerful actors. And they deserve a lot more scrutiny from many more journalists. So I think that is one space that more people should be scrutinizing. Apart from that, I guess general environmental, wildlife, tribal rights themes, there's always a lot happening.
Yeah.
And on the margins of the country, like Nicobar Islands, which people otherwise wouldn't know much about. So I don't know how many people today heard about Shompen for the first time, or the Nicobaris for the first time. So yeah, we need to know a lot more about our own citizens. So yeah, little more of the margins. Who are these people?
People, not just the ecosystem.
Yeah. And wildlife also. So even the giant turtle, the leatherback turtle. So even that, it is an endangered species.
Sure.
So yeah, biodiversity reporting also.
All right. Thank you so much, Rishika. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. We are obviously going to open this up as an area of exploration going forward. In addition to topics that you think we should discuss, if there are other guests who you think we should have on the show, please let me know in your comments. That's all we have for now. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next episode.